It's 5:01, and since we have a long-established custom of being on time, let's start this next Wednesday. I'm Juan Carlos De Martin. I'm a co-director of the Nexa Center for Internet and Society here at Politecnico. My other two co-directors are here, Maurizio Borghi and Marco Ricolfi. Welcome to this monthly meeting that we have on the second Wednesday of each month, apart from August. The formula is always the same, with a slight variation in this case. The formula of our next Wednesday is 2 hours, roughly 1 hour for our guest. Our distinguished guest today will be introduced by Maurizio Borghi in a second. And then interaction with the public, because we always want to have interaction with the people attending our meetings. We will end on time, unless there is a roaring request for additional comments and questions. But traditionally, we end on time at the maximum at 7 p.m. The Nexa Center for Internet Society is an interdisciplinary center regarding digital technologies, broadly speaking. And we have also another meeting on the fourth Wednesday of each month at lunchtime called the Nexa Lunch Seminars. Having said that, allow me to welcome our Vice Rector for Community and Society, Professor Stefano Sacchi, who is kind enough to be here to bring the greetings of the governors, and particularly of the Rector of the Politecnico, Stefano Cognati. Welcome, Stefano.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. Thank you, Dr. Stallman, for being here. Thanks to each and all of you. I'm very glad here to welcome you to an event that is an event of Politecnico by Nexa. And we are very supportive of the many initiatives that are occurring in the field of let's call it public engagement here at Politecnico, and Nexa clearly, Nexa predates most of such initiatives. It was born almost 20 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, in 2006, and so I'm here to testify the continuing endorsement of Politecnico towards such initiatives, Nexa, and actually I would like to see more of these Nexa Wednesdays in events, in rooms this large and involving such a big part of our community. So thank you so much to the three of you, and thank you for continuing to have these events. And actually, be sure that we will continue to endorse and sustain Nexa and Nexa's events. They are very important for us. Thank you so much, Maurizio.
Let me just add a very few words to introduce our guest today. That really doesn't need any introduction. Everybody knows Dr. Richard Stallman. In 1983, he started the development of the GNU operating system, and the GNU Linux system basically is used in 10 million of computers today. But more importantly, perhaps, Dr. Stallman is the founder of the Free Software Foundation and an advocate of free software for quite some time. I think I saw your presentation in Italy 20 years ago, maybe, when I was started being interested in these issues, legal issues around copyright and information technology. So, without further ado, I will leave the floor now to Dr. Stallman. Just a few housekeeping issues. Dr. Stallman will speak, I don't know, you have up to 1 hour. It's really up to you to how to use this time. At the end, he will be glad to receive some questions, but questions you are invited to write your questions. So we will leave a little time at the end of the speech, so to allow any of you to submit your written question. Outside, you will find some paper and pens.
Well, I suggest handing out the paper while I am speaking.
Okay.
And you can start writing your questions while I'm speaking. I suggest you wait half an hour at least, because some of your points will be answered and you won't need to ask. But don't wait till I stop. You know, start writing your question before I'm finished, and then I'll get questions right away.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
And the reason for these papers is that I have hearing problems, and if I tried to take your questions by listening to them, it would cause very long, boring, unpleasant delays. This solution works more efficiently,
Okay,
as you will see.
Okay, thanks again for joining the Nexa Center today and with your speech, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope that doesn't mean I'll have to clean it every week. Anyway, just to let you know, the name GNU is pronounced GNU. We never spell it out. That's too slow. It's much better to just say GNU. And the other thing is that free software is software libero in Italian. It does not mean software gratis. We're not talking about price. We're talking about something much more important, namely your freedom. So now I will start this video introduction, which introduces the basic concepts of free software much more compactly than I could do if I tried to do it again now.
Free software is the first battle in the liberation of cyberspace. Who controls your computer? Is it you? Or is it some big company that's really controlling it? Well, what is a computer? A computer is a universal machine. It will do any computation you want it to, because you give it a program that says what the computation is that you want. So the computer only knows how to get out an instruction and do it, and get out another instruction and do it. The program has the instructions. It says what to do. So by writing the right program, you can make it do anything. Well, almost anything. So who gives the instructions to your computer? You might think it's obeying your instructions, when really it's obeying somebody else first, and you, only as much as that company wants it to, will let it listen to you. With software, there are two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. It's inevitably one or the other. So in order for the users to control the program, they need the four essential freedoms. And that's the definition of free software. Free software respects the user's freedom and community. Now, we often call it Libre, using the French or Spanish word. Pronounce it as you like. The point is, that's what we mean. We don't mean it's gratis. We're not talking about price. We're concerned with your freedom. And we sometimes say free/Libre to show that. So freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish for whatever purpose. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does the computing you want it to do. But what is the source code? Well, every program typically will have two forms. There's the form that you can read and you can understand if you know the programming language. That's the source. That's what programmers write and change. Then there's the executable, which is a bunch of numbers which even a programmer can't figure out. If all you get is the executable, it's a horrible pain in the neck to figure out what it does, and even harder to change it. So to give you the real possibility to study and change it, they've got to give you the source code. That's a requirement. Well, with those two freedoms, each user separately can make a copy and start changing it and make it do what she wants. That's individual control. But what if you're not a programmer? You look at the source code and you don't understand it. Individual control isn't enough. We also need collective control, which means any group of users are free to work together to adapt the program to what they want. Of course, in the group, some of them are programmers. They're the ones who actually write the changes, but they're doing it as part of the group for what the group wants. Of course, the group doesn't have to be everybody. So others can use it some other way. They're all free to do that. So collective control requires two more essential freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies, to make the copies and then give them away or sell them when you wish. And freedom 3 is similar, but it's for your modified versions. You're free to make copies and then give them or sell them when you wish. So if you do have these freedoms, then it's free software. The users control the program. But if any of those freedoms is missing, then the users don't control the program. Instead, the program controls the users, and the developer controls the program. So that means this program is an instrument of unjust power for its developer over the users. That means the users don't have freedom. That's non-free proprietary software, which we got to get rid of. Well, when you've got proprietary software, what happens? Sometimes the program snoops on the user. Sometimes it tracks the user. Sometimes it restricts the user and stops users from doing what they want to do. You can see that the blue ray is your enemy. Sometimes the software remotely deletes books, as Amazon did with 1984. Sometimes the developer compels users to install a harmful upgrade by threatening to take away other functionality if it's not installed, as Sony did. And sometimes they can even forcibly change the software at a distance, as Microsoft can with Windows through the universal backdoor. So sometimes they even sabotage users, as Microsoft does when it tells the NSA about bugs in Windows so it can use them to attack people's computers. Well, what you get is basically, with proprietary software, the owner has power over the users and takes advantage of this power, putting in those various malicious functionalities to hurt the users. Of course, they don't do this because they're sadists. They're doing it just for money, for greed. They have various ways that they can profit from having this power over users, which does not make it even the tiniest bit less evil. But they have no shame about it. They have conferences where they talk about the latest ways they can take advantage of users through the power they have. Basically, proprietary software, which is now from almost all the users of proprietary software, they're using proprietary malware. It's software for suckers. So how do you stop being the victim? Formally, you had to stop using computers, but not anymore. Now you can come join us in the free world that we've built. In 1983, I announced I would develop a completely free software operating system called GNU. In 1992, we had it almost finished, but one piece was missing, the kernel. Linus Torvalds in that year freed his kernel Linux, which filled the last gap and gave us the first complete system you could run on a PC, GNU plus Linux. So unfortunately, having freedom at one point doesn't guarantee you'll keep it. There are over 1,000 different variants of GNU/Linux. They're called distributions. A few of them are entirely free software. Most of them have non-free software added because they're maintained by people who aren't concerned about freedom. They'd rather add convenience at the cost of freedom. So you have to check which is a free distro. To keep your freedom sometimes requires a sacrifice, sometimes a big sacrifice. as at Lexington. Sometimes, but in our campaign, they tend to be little sacrifices. Anybody with a little bit of maturity can make these sacrifices. For instance, you want applications, but some of them are non-free. If you want freedom, you got to do without them. So there may be some inconveniences you have to suffer for your freedom's sake. Then many websites send non-free programs written in JavaScript to the user's browser. If you don't want to run non-free programs, you should install Libre.js, which keeps out non-free JavaScript. And sometimes servers will offer to do your computing. They say, send us all your data, obviously for suckers. Then the server does the computing and sends you back the results. But you're not supposed to think about what's happening because it's a cloud and you don't see what's going on. Well, you should look. It's software as a service as a software substitute, and it takes away control of your computing. So a large fraction of the world's web servers are running GNU/Linux and other free software. But I think the most important computers to put freedom in are your computers, not companies' web servers. They deserve freedom also. But above all, it's people that deserve freedom. So we need to advance. And to do that, we have to cross obstacles. One of them is there are big companies that make a lot of money by having control over users, and they don't want to let us advance. We have to overcome their opposition. Another is that the mainstream media don't talk about free software. They have a term that they use to bury these ethical issues. They say open source instead. Now, it talks about more or less the same programs, but with different ideas, where free software activists say, this is a matter of right and wrong. Users deserve freedom. We demand freedom. The people who say open source, they don't want to say that. So instead they say, let the users change the software and redistribute it, and they'll make the code better. They'll fix some bugs. It may be true, but it's a less important issue. If we want to keep our freedom, we've got to talk about freedom. So say free software, and you're helping us every time. Another obstacle is that lots of schools teach non-free software, which is basically like teaching the kids to smoke tobacco. It's implanting dependence, which is the opposite of what schools should do. A school should prepare citizens to live in a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society, which means teaching free software in the school. But there's another reason to do that for education. Some kids want to become programmers. They're curious. They want to know how the programs work. Well, the one who's studying a free software can understand it. The one who's studying a non-free program can't learn anything because the knowledge in the non-free program is withheld, denied to the students. So to uphold the spirit of education, the school should make sure its programs are free. But there's an even more important reason. Schools should teach the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping other people. So the class should say, if you bring a program to class, just as if you bring cookies to class, you've got to share it with everyone else. Can't keep it to yourself. You got to share the source code so other people can learn. So don't bring any proprietary software to this class. The school has to set a good example by following its own rule. It should bring only free software to class, except as a reverse engineering exercise. Another obstacle is there's hardware we don't know how to write free software for because they won't tell us how to use the hardware. That's shocking. They want to sell you the product and they won't tell you how to use it. They say, here's a non-free program you can use, run it and shut up. Don't bother us. Well, how do we find out how to run that hardware? With reverse engineering, you've got to study all those zeros and ones to figure out what they really do and write down how to use that hardware so someone else can write the free program to do it. It's hard work, but it can be done. If you want to make a big technical contribution, that's what you should do. Each new activity of life can bring with it new human rights that are necessary. And the human rights depend on each other. If you lose one, it becomes harder to maintain the others. So nowadays, computing is so important in society that the freedoms of free software are among the human rights that society must establish and protect. Thus, how to help? Well, you can write free software. You can organize groups to campaign and persuade schools and governments to move to free software. You can help other people when they have trouble using free software or help them install it. You can say free software and spread the philosophical ideas. Moving to free software is the first step in the liberation of cyberspace. But of course, we also use the internet. We need other freedoms there, like network neutrality and putting an end to surveillance of people in general.
Now that you've heard these basics, I will cover some more advanced topics. One of them is copyleft. You've probably heard the term copyleft, but you may not know what it is. Well, due to a rather harmful treaty called the Berne Convention, in most countries in the world, every written work is automatically copyrighted. And the result is every program, when written, is copyrighted. And as a result, people are not allowed to share it and change it and publish their modified versions. So it's non-free software. Well, you can make it free software by adding a license that gives people permission to copy, modify, and redistribute. And those licenses are called free software licenses if they adequately provide every user with the 4 freedoms. But there's more than one way to do that. If you do it in the simple ways, using a weak basically say yes to everything license. The problem is, suppose I release a program that way, which says at the top, you can do anything you like with this code. Well, that would make it free. Users of my version would get the 4 freedoms. And if you made a modified version and you didn't change that notice at the top, that version would be free too. But there are people who would like to make their versions proprietary, and they could do that just by putting a different notice at the top. And so there would be non-free, modified or improved versions of my program, and users would get them but would not get freedom with them. They would not be allowed to change and redistribute those versions, and I would have to compete with all of them. They would have an advantage. They could use all my new changes, but I couldn't use their changes. And that is not conducive to continuing freedom. I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to make sure that every version of my program that was released to the public would carry the 4 freedoms. And so I found a way to require that legally, making use of copyright law, but use in the opposite of the usual way, because copyright law was designed to help some people get power over others by restricting what can be done with copies of works. I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to protect everyone from subjugation by assuring everyone freedom with their use of my works, of all versions. Every copy of every version of the program I release should be free. And so I designed a way of doing that with copyright law. I said, well, you can do all these things with this program, but there is a condition, a requirement. And the requirement is when you redistribute a copy, with or without changes, that copy must carry the same notice as this one. the same copyright license. So when a program is copylefted, anybody's free to make copies of it and redistribute those, but only with the same license, and is free to make changes, improvements in the code, and distribute that, but only with the same license. And that means every version carries freedom to its users. So the two main categories of free software licenses are copylefted and non-copylefted. Now, in both cases, if the version you get carries the free license, it is free software. But by copylefting the program, you add your contribution to the defense of freedom lastingly. And that is important. It's so important that companies such as Apple and Google put a lot of money into trying to get rid of copyleft. They pay people to make their programs non-copyleft, which shows that copyleft is something important. You can help thwart big tech from making free software something that they can use to subjugate others by making your programs copyleft. So, now, there's a lot of confusion between GNU and Linux. This confusion started in 1992 when Linux was freed and fit into the gap in the GNU system. People started talking about that whole combination and calling it a Linux system, which basically wrote us out of the history. Aside from being incorrect, it has the result of supporting Torvalds' views, and he's not a free software supporter. He initially made Linux a non-free program. Its license was restrictive and didn't fully grant freedoms 2 and 3. So, well, it's a good thing he changed his mind and did make it free, but he's never been philosophically a supporter of that idea. So if you call the system Linux, you give Torvalds the big platform, and you thus help spread his views and encourage people who like this system, GNU plus Linux, to adopt his views. And you have a right to do that, but I suggest that that's not the best thing for you to do, especially if you care about freedom for software users. If you tell the real story of where that system came from, people might see a reason to stand up for freedom, insist on freedom, and contribute to maintaining the freedom, which is what we need if we're going to keep it. Freedom today is threatened as it hasn't been in recent decades. I've read that Facebook, a couple of weeks ago, labeled Linux, quote, Linux, unquote, as malware, and it was, and forbade discussions of Linux. People who tried to post things using the term Linux found that their accounts were shut down. This is from a posting on DistroWatch. It's rather shocking. I'm going to ask someone to verify this, but it doesn't surprise me all that much because recently those big tech companies mostly got together with the dishonest president of the United States and decided to all work together to enrich each other. They have a government now which is corporatist, and wants to enrich the billionaires. And, well, as you know, Google and Apple don't like copyleft. So who knows what's happening here. But Facebook is also involved in this combine where by supporting each other, they can make more money. This didn't happen before. It shocked me because it was so different from everything that happened before. Let's see what we can discuss more. I've been asked to talk about free software and the university. Well, I said a little about free software in schools in the video, but we now find nowadays that many universities give students no freedom to choose what software they personally are going to run. Universities will say, we've set up a mailing account for you. It's on Gmail or it's on Microsoft's email, and you have to use that account. We won't talk with you any other way, but maybe you can get that account forwarded to someplace else. And if so, it solves that problem for you. You don't have to use that site. Google's Gmail requires running non-free software to communicate with it. So if a university told me to use that, I'd say, sorry, can't do that. I can't access that site because I never run non-free software on my computers. It's a moral principle, and so whatever you send there, I'm not going to see it. Just understand that. But if you arrange to forward that to this address, then I'll see it. But then universities also tell students, you have to participate in a discussion using Zoom. Well, the Zoom client is non-free software, and the terms and conditions for using Zoom are unjust. They include censorship. A university that decided to use Zoom for its academic seminars and discussions found that Zoom shut down one of them, saying, we've decided this topic is illegal. Was it really illegal? The university's lawyers didn't think so. But the university had no say over the matter once it decided to use Zoom and signed that contract. Well, no one should agree to the terms and conditions of using Zoom. If somebody said, I'd really like to talk with you for this or that purpose, so please join this Zoom call, I'd say, and I do say, sorry, I can't do that. Zoom's client is non-free software. I'm not going to run that. And I'm not going to agree to their terms and conditions either. But you've got to be prepared to do that too. When some powerful organization tells people, this is the software you have to use, and it's unjust software, it's up to you to push back. And there are various ways to push back, of course. You don't have to do that by shaking your fist. You could do that by asking very nicely, look, I can't run this. Could we please use a different method here? Could this discussion please enable some of us to join using Big Blue Button? It's possible to gateway the two using the share screen feature. If one machine is running both clients and it can share screen between the two, people using both programs can hear the same discussion. And that way, users, students, and faculty who don't want to run Zoom can still participate. It's accessible to them. And so that's all you need to ask for. And maybe you can achieve it by asking very nicely. In fact, it's good to ask nicely. That avoids creating opposition. So, a few years ago, I heard from a student who had written down all the things he had had to do in his last year of university to avoid running various non-free programs. Boy, was he clever and flexible and persistent. And he avoided so many teachers telling him, oh, run this thing, run that thing. Some classes will try to tell you to use software tools that are non-free, just because the professor likes that. Well, maybe you can't do anything about what that particular professor thinks, but you can ask the university to let you have an alternative, like demonstrate you know that material, and then be allowed not to take that class. That's one approach. Another is wait till another year, maybe there'll be a different teacher who's more flexible. There are lots of things you can do if you look for ways to get around each problem. So it's not necessarily always a matter of changing the way the system works, although that's the best thing to achieve. That can be complete success, and it can cure that problem for good and all. But it's not the only way to avoid the problem. So that can be found inside gnu.org/education. Now, another topic that interests people a lot nowadays is that of so-called artificial intelligence. That term is a misleading marketing hype term, which we should carefully reject, and I do. Especially since it includes two very different kinds of systems. Some systems recognize patterns. They can learn to recognize and classify patterns, classify instances in some domain according to various patterns, and they learn what patterns are interesting. And those programs can do real jobs more accurately in some cases than a human can. When that happens, I can't deny that those programs have intelligence. Intelligence, as I see it, means the ability to understand things and to know things perhaps within some narrow domain. So it's narrow, limited intelligence, but it's still intelligence. But those systems, which I would describe as indeed artificial intelligence, are constantly lumped together with the systems I call bullshit generators, things like ChatGPT, things that play with text, jam sentences together, and produce smooth-sounding output, but they do it with no understanding or knowledge of the subject that the text talks about. So it's no surprise that they output text that is mistaken. How could they know that these texts are mistaken? They don't know what's true or what's not true, ever. They only know how to make text sound smooth. So sometimes they generate a list of facts to refer to, and those facts are just not true. Sometimes they generate a list of references with their URLs, and they're pointing at pages that never existed. But they don't know they don't really know what a URL means. They don't know it's supposed to identify a page that people could visit. It's just some text, which is text of a sort that appears in lots of places, and that's all that matters to them. So they cannot know or learn or understand anything. And we know this because of how they function. So I implore you not to describe those as intelligence. They're certainly artificial, right? Any program is artificial. They don't write themselves naturally. They don't evolve. But the point is they're not intelligence. So the marketing term lumps these two kinds of systems together. But these systems are so different that it's a terrible mistake to lump them together. And you will, once you think about this, you will constantly find articles which talk about both kinds of systems as if they were the same thing. And they will present some examples of AI programs that have learned to discriminate categories, and that's all they do is discriminate categories, but they do it in an accurate way. And then they'll, in the next paragraph, talk about ChatGPT or its competitors as if they were talking about the same kind of thing. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding. And it's the reason why so many people think that ChatGPT has almost got there to human-style intelligence, because they've been told that it is an example of intelligence. They don't know how long that is. And this may be the reason some of those companies' stock has gone way up to the point that lots of people are boosters of them just because other people are. So by distinguishing these two categories, we can help the world think about these two different issues separately and understand each one. Now, we are seeing an attempt to make copyright law more strict than it ever was. Lots of authors and artists are complaining that some of these bullshit generator systems have been trained using their work, and as a result can find how to make smooth text, occasionally learning something from a little piece of the work of one of those authors, say. And the result is they're saying this should be illegal. Training anything on copyrighted work should be forbidden. Well, that would be an attack on freedom that people engaged in the computational study of literature have been doing for many years, which is recognizing the patterns in the way people write. And this is used, for instance, to identify the real author of some old work, train something to recognize the patterns in so-and-so's work, and also to recognize other patterns in that writer's work, and then see which of them show up in the work to be studied. And that way you can get an idea of who really wrote it. Now this has never, training this kind of discrimination has never been considered to violate copyright. But now these authors are pushing for that far-reaching change. My view is, if a bullshit generator generates output which has substantial similarity to a particular copyrighted work, that's copyright infringement, but otherwise it's not. That is more along the lines of how copyright law has worked. It's also an avoidance of a big grab of additional power. Based on seeing previous examples in the past, I think that the publishers want to gain this additional power, and they are doing what they've done in the past, which is bringing out famous, admired authors and artists who will then say, they're stealing from us. This should be illegal. And if they get their way, these few big publishers, the ones resulting from all the mergers, they will have great additional power. Now, one of the things that has attacked free software repeatedly is the attempt to design computers that can't copy or play the authorized copies of anything. This is known as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management, as we call it. In a PC nowadays, the display screen, like this one, it expects to receive encrypted data showing a screen. And that encrypted data comes from the computer, and the computers will send that output based on, say, data found from the internet or read off the disk. And the point is, they don't want there to be any way you can see what that data is supposed to look like, except to run their non-free software, which is designed to restrict you. So it's a fundamental attack on computer users' software freedom for the purpose of stopping people from sharing. I think it is a fundamental injustice to forbid people to share with each other. It's an example of divide and rule, which is why it is. So my response to that is, if you publish something with DRM, I don't want it. I can live without seeing that thing you published. If it is offered only in an unjust way with digital handcuffs, I'd rather refuse to ever see it than let you put the digital handcuffs on my hands. Of course, there is another way. Sometimes people succeed in breaking the handcuffs, in figuring out another way to decrypt that encrypted data, and I think that's perfectly legitimate. But the fundamental choice you always have is to say, no thanks. So I urge everyone to develop the strength to say, I don't need to watch that. I don't need to listen to that. Out, damn Spotify. Flick off Netflix. And that way, we make a sacrifice of some enjoyable activity, but there are plenty of other enjoyable activities we can do without making that sacrifice of our freedom. So it mostly comes down to what your values are. Our society will teach you to feel you desperately need to see that thing or hear that thing, and they come under restrictions that are unfair and intolerable, taking away your freedom, involving giving some company power to control your computer, and they teach you not to value the freedom itself. They teach you to accept non-free software as normal. Wow, what kind of silly person would refuse to use this and that? We all use this and that. Well, not all of us. Some of us don't. And if you want to support the free software movement, one important thing to do is start rejecting some pieces of the wall of non-free software. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Far from it. You can take small steps and keep going as long as you feel the motivation to do so. Saying no to unjust technology, even once, is helping our movement. But once you've got used to rejecting one kind of non-free technology, you may feel that you'd like to reject another piece of it. So you can keep taking a step up the freedom ladder. You can find the freedom ladder in fsf.org. And it's up to you when you take another step or when you don't. So give it a try. The main thing is don't just surrender at the start, which is what the non-free ecosystem will lead you to do. One of the nastiest practices I've seen is in the so-called smart devices. For smart, you should read Snoop. But they have chosen an architecture. It's the usual architecture nowadays, which is completely designed to give the manufacturer power over the users. So someone buys the device and plugs it in, and it says, I want to connect to your Wi-Fi. So a person tells it to connect. And then it starts talking to the manufacturer's server. And if the owner, so-called owner, wants to give the device a command, well, that command has to go to the manufacturer's server, which sends it back to the device. The device may be 2 feet away from the user, but there's no way to give the commands directly. The only way to tell that device what to do is send a message to the manufacturer's server, which sends a message to the device. And yeah, the device will carry out the command, but the manufacturer knows what the command was. It's snooping on everything. And if the device has a response, that goes through the manufacturer's server too. It's snooping on everything. The most shocking example was a sex toy. A remote-controlled sex toy controlled through the internet. A vibrator. And so this means that the manufacturer was keeping track of all the commands. Of course, whoever gave the command, I expect, had to have an account. So the manufacturer would know whose device it was and who was sending commands to it. So it would know of both the parties involved in the use. And the device was designed with a thermometer in it. Why do the users of a vibrator need to know the temperature of anything? Well, they don't. That thermometer is there to help the manufacturer figure out what people are doing. With that thermometer, they can tell whether the device is in contact with the human body. And I suspect they can also tell how it is in contact with that human body, because they get different temperature readings. This is utterly nasty. And it could be avoided, you know. You can make devices that will have an interface to free software running on your own computer. And if you wanted to give a command yourself, you just have your own computer send the command. But if you want someone else to give the command, you can arrange for that someone to send a message to you any way you like. Whatever method you use will work, and then the message that comes in, you send over to the device. It would do the same job, but in a way that is not designed for snooping on you. We call that design for devices tethered. Devices that are tethered to a particular server. And by the way, the manufacturer might decide that product isn't generating enough profit, so it will shut down the server. And at that point, all those devices become useless because there's no longer a server to communicate with them through. I read a few months ago about a brand of car which received commands through the manufacturer's server, and the manufacturer may have folded and it shut down the server, and those cars were all bricked. But this is the natural result of making things with that design. Maybe there should be a law saying every product that can accept commands through the internet must have a fully documented local interface for receiving commands from the owner's computer. And this way, you could always manage to use your own device in a way that didn't snoop on you. So, it's just about time to end. I'd like to ask you to join the Free Software Foundation. That's how to give us support we need. You can join through fsf.org, and because we have made a special effort, you can make a payment to the FSF through the net without running any non-free software. Most websites, if you try to make a payment, will demand you run non-free JavaScript code, and well, I would never do that. I never do that. But the FSF, because that would be against our principles, it's against our principles to ask you to run non-free software. So we don't. And please, therefore, donate to support us. We also have a mailing list of announcements that you can join. It gets a message a few times a month. If you would like to help by volunteering to do work, take a look at gnu.org/help. Of course, one kind of work is writing software, but there are other kinds too. You can help write documentation. You can help translate our website into various other languages, such as perhaps Italian. Join one of the translation teams. There are also administrative committees that help the GNU project keep running. A lot of different kinds of ways to help. Please contribute some help, do some work. That's how it all gets done. Another thing you should know is, when this is over, I'm going to ask you to come outside with me and go to the street, and there I'm going to auction well, I have this adorable GNU that needs a home, and I can sign the card if you buy it. And there's also this adorable book that needs a home. It's my book of essays, Free Software, Free Society, 3rd edition, and I can sign it if you buy it. So come out there with me. But at this point, I'm going to have to give you a chance to write and also go to the toilet. Can someone show me where that is? So I'd like you to go and collect the questions that are ready. You might as well collect them now if some are ready, and I can start answering now.
One ready.
Okay. This is not to rush you. You can keep writing till you're ready with your questions. But in the meantime, those that are finished, I can answer now. So, do you think there are important points in common between free software movement and ecological sustainability? Fundamentally, they're different ideas. Ecological sustainability has to do with resources that might be scarce and pollution, destruction that our lives can cause in the world. And it's in a matter of how much, a little bit of any waste product is going to be safe. Too much of it can cause harm. Using up a little of some resource will cause problems. If you use more and more and more, eventually it causes problems. But non-free software is not a matter of how much. If something takes away your freedom, that's an injustice. It shouldn't happen at all ever. So these are fundamentally different issues. In practice, though, they do relate. For instance, non-free software is what makes possible the practice of programmed obsolescence. There are many ways that companies use non-free software to cause programmed obsolescence. GNU plus Linux, and free software more generally, is famous for making it possible for users to keep old hardware running. But to do that, you have to install different software on it, and to make it do communicate in more modern protocols, do more modern jobs. And you can't do that with a system controlled by a company that wants you to buy a new computer instead. So what about technological solutions or political points should we bring up? Or common ground? Well, I think I already answered that as much as I can. What is the one thing that you have that you love and regret the most in your career life? Well, I mean, I've made mistakes along the way. I had to learn somehow. I wasn't a movement leader when I started this in 1984. I'd never done anything like that. I had never managed a group of people before, so I learned to do it, but not perfectly, of course. But I don't have an answer to this question. In the past, the free software communities were global and inclusive. Now, if you have something, no nationality or Russian, or do not agree with new gender, several communities ban you because you do not agree with their cancel culture. Well, free software can't ban you for reasons like that, but a group of people isn't compelled to associate with you. And you can be part of another group that isn't compelled to associate with them. But you will find that that doesn't stop you from using free software and working with the people who do want to work with you. Do you think that Bill Gates will be real philanthropists after make money with Microsoft business model? Well, I don't know. I mean, I've read about how some of Gates's philanthropy actually helps Microsoft get more power, you know, donating money to causes, but the money it has to get used to buy computers for Microsoft, or, you know, but I don't actually care that much about what Bill Gates does or not. Because this is not a campaign to fight Microsoft. It's not a movement to hate Bill Gates. Because he's just one person. And the issues we're concerned here are not about specific people. They're about what's right to do and what's wrong to do. How to remunerate programmers. I don't think we need a way to pay programmers, because there are many. For instance, we can get together and contribute funds to a project to pay programmers to develop a particular thing, the thing we want, whatever that is. So we have ways to pay programmers. A lot of paid programming, in fact, is custom programming. For instance, there are people who will build a website for you. You'll have to pay, of course. Unless you're doing a very worthy cause, nobody's going to want to do that work for you gratis. Okay, so you pay. But the important thing is, an ethical website builder will use only free software as the basis and will release all of her own work to you under a free software license. And that way, that developer is getting paid to write free software. So it's all ethical. Is the software tax of the GNU Manifesto still possible? Well, it's not politically feasible, but there are governments that support development of free software. In Europe, that happens a lot. What do you think about RISC-V? Well, RISC-V is not a hardware design. It's an instruction set design. And its virtue is that it's not covered by patents as far as anyone can tell. So if you want to design a processor, it's useful to have RISC-V. You implement that instruction spec and you avoid one kind of danger. So I think in that sense, RISC-V is a good thing, but it's not a design for a computer you can use. It's just a step towards one. And what do you think? What are your views on free hardware in general? The concept of free hardware doesn't make sense. That is, if you want it to be analogous to free software, that particular definition of free does not make sense for physical objects. It makes sense for a program precisely because it's not a physical object. It's an idealized mathematical object, although it is useful in practice with a computer. What does make sense is to ask whether a given hardware design is free. A design is something like a program. It's a work that is sort of mathematical. It's about parts and how they relate to each other. So a design is also a kind of work of authorship. So in those respects, it is like a program, whereas a physical piece of hardware is not. So we, instead of asking, is this computer or this flashlight free, we should ask, is this designed for a computer or this designed for a flashlight? Are those designs free? Take a look at gnu.org/philosophy/free-hardware-designs.html. What do you think of decentralized social networks? I'm posting on Mastodon. I think it's okay. Why do you think about, what do you think about, quote, open source, unquote, LLMs? Well, as you know, I'm not an advocate of open source. I don't use the word open to describe what I'm for, because that doesn't bring up the issue of freedom. It misses the point. So you can take a look at gnu.org/philosophy/open source misses the point.html, which thoroughly explains the relationship and differences between free software and open source. But as for, so I'm not interested in the idea of open source anything. I asked, is this free software? And if an LLM is going to be useful, if you're going to use an LLM for anything whatsoever, you should make sure it's a free one, because using a non-free program means you're under somebody's power. But that's a separate question from whether an LLM is good for anything. Well, I know one thing, it's one legitimate use for an LLM. It's to waste the time of somebody who's trying to trick you and steal your money. That's a perfectly ethical use, and it's amusing too, and that's a good hack. But I wouldn't do that using a non-free LLM, or using the kind of LLM which is not released at all. It's only running on somebody's server, and you have to ask somebody's server to do it for you. That's even worse than a non-free program. You have no control at all over what that thing that's running on so-and-so's server is actually going to do. What do you think about autonomous subsystems usually implemented by CPU manufacturers in the name of user safety? Things like the Intel management engine, I call that a hardware backdoor. I'm using a rather old computer because it doesn't have a management engine. Well, actually, it has one, but at that date, you could turn it off completely and it would never do anything. In the newer Intel CPUs, you can't do that. It won't boot properly if the management engine isn't enabled for at least some time. And we don't have a way of knowing that it's really deactivated fully after it gets switched off. So those are unjust. That should be illegal. Many universities like this one, use proctoring exam platforms that nail the lives of free software users, that make the lives of free software users very hard. I don't know exactly. I mean, I've read about some of those systems which are really nasty. The university tells you to install it on your own computer. I'm not going to install a thing like that on my computer, aside from the fact it wouldn't run because my computer is running GNU plus Linux, and those things only run on non-free systems. But aside from that, they're non-free software. I will not allow non-free software in my computer. So I would propose to the university a different solution. I would say, that thing can't run on any of my computers. But here's another solution I propose to you. You must have a few computers. How about if you put one of your computers in a little room where there's nothing else, and you watch me go in there and I don't have anything to refer to, and I'll just sit at your computer and do the exam. If it's just a matter of an exam once in a while, I could treat that like a kiosk. And I think it's basically okay to use the university's kiosk once in a while, just as I use a bank's kiosk once in a while to withdraw money. So in that case, it's the university that's running the non-free software, and all I'm doing is talk in its kiosk. And that's bad for the university. I would advise the university to insist on free software to put in its kiosk. But I don't have to insist on that. It's the university's problem, not mine. Just as if the bank runs some non-free software that the bank doesn't control in its ATM, well, that's the that's the bank's problem, not mine. I still don't mind using the ATM to withdraw money, as long as the bank doesn't cheat me, and it never has. It's not my problem. It's not affecting my freedom. It's affecting the bank's freedom. And there's no need to boycott an institution because it's doing something foolish. I understand the need for these programs, but wonder if the university can provide for exams without something against free software. I think I answered that. If I didn't, then ask me again. Ask me some more later. How do you earn money with free software? Well, I've described some ways. In fact, a lot of free software business is being done. Some European countries are pushing for free software. The French government wants to use free software in all of its departments. They've learned that non-free software is a trap. What do you think about Bitcoin? Are they something with free software? Well, the software to do Bitcoin is free. So in that regard, Bitcoin is okay. I don't use Bitcoin. I never did. And the reason is, it's not something I want. It doesn't do something I want to do. It's not really useful for making anonymous purchases. One bad thing about it is that it's a currency and it fluctuates. You can make a lot of money or lose a lot of money. I don't want that in the currency that I use to buy things or get paid in. And another is, it's hard to, unless you're doing mining, it's hard to get Bitcoins anonymously. And another thing is, every transaction is recorded. So in theory, your wallet could be anonymous and they could never figure out who you are. But if it ever does get identified as yours, all of your transactions are there to be looked at. Now that's not as good as what happens with real money. And another thing is, Bitcoin can be useful for hiding wealth from taxation. And that leads to poverty for most people. That's one of the big problems of the world that we must put an end to. So we are developing a better kind of system for anonymous payments. It's called GNU Dollar. Now, dollar is not a currency. You can't speculate in Tyler tokens. Tyler tokens are denominated in some currency used outside of Tyler, probably the money of your country. And you could buy some Tyler tokens, and you buy them from a bank. You have to qualify yourself to do that. But due to a technique called blind signatures, when you spend these Tyler tokens, the payee cannot identify you, and if the payee, however, does have to, the receiver of the funds has to identify itself. So it can't hide its income, but you can hide what you bought. And so the payee gets your Tyler tokens, but it can't identify you. And when it sends those Tyler tokens to the bank can't identify you. Among all the people who bought Tyler tokens, it can't tell which one you are. For more information, look at Tyler.net. Do you think there are ethical ways for, a word that causes me disgust, monetization? No, forget it. I'm not going to refer to anything that way. You mean profiting from data collection? Well, in general, no. I may have missed something, but basically, I say we should design systems so that nobody collects data about you. It makes me angry when Italian railroads demand that I give my name. And now they demand that I give either a mobile phone number, which I don't have, so that's impossible, or an email address, but I don't want them to have my email address. So what do? Well, they're not really going to like it. I think, though, that the supposed reason for that is to have a way of notifying me during the trip or before the trip. Well, that's not going to work, Buster. There's no way. If they send me an email, if I gave them my usual email address, well, I would see their message someday, but I'm so backlogged, there's no reason to think I would see it before taking the trip. So if that's the purpose, well, it's kind of them to try to help, but it won't work. And in any case, why should they demand it? That's really nasty and incomprehensible. And they didn't in the past. The last time I was in Italy, they didn't insist you give one or the other of those. What am I supposed to do? Give something made up? An email address that no one knows is mine and that they'll never see? Where should we define the line for freedom? Well, I've been telling you a lot of details about where I draw the line in the area of computing. But, of course, there are many other issues of freedom in the world, and each one raises issues of where to put a whole bunch of lines. And so there's no simple general answer to that. Plus 40 years of pushing this idea, do you think you've done any mistakes? I do. I make lots of mistakes because I'm not perfect, but I really don't like just saying, oh, look at this thing I did wrong. I do things sometimes wrong, but I do my best. And the important thing is, at least I persist in trying. And the people who criticize my mistakes usually aren't trying at all. If they were trying, they might do some things I haven't succeeded in doing. That would be great. The important thing is, try to champion freedom. commit yourself to championing freedom and advance freedom in some ways. What do you think of open source hardware? Okay, that's repetitive. How to make money? I think I explained a few ways. There are others. What are your thoughts on the peer-to-peer networking model? Well, I'm not completely sure. That's so general. Maybe whoever it is could explain it more concretely what the question is about. Does it mean, yeah, what? Could you speak loud, please? Shout.
Can you hear me?
Yes, if you shout.
I mean, do you think that there's an alternative to the current client-server model that relies on peer-to-peer?
Oh, now I understand. Yes, that's better. Now, there are legitimate uses for servers that you can talk to with a client. But that's basically when the server belongs to some organization and you are a customer of that organization or a participant, and you're really talking to the organization, which sometimes you have a reason to do. For that, client-server is okay. But if what you're really trying to do is some kind of communication with other users, going through the server is making it easy for that organization to censor you, snoop on you, manipulate you. Some are more ethical and some are less so. So basically, I'm in favor of setting up peer-to-peer communication systems for users to use. What do you think of unupgradable firmware and hardware that cannot run free software? Well, first of all, I don't think it's wrong if firmware can't be changed. Then it's effectively a part of the hardware. However, what's really bad, what's unjust, is if someone else can change the firmware in the computer I bought, but I can't change it. That's unjust. If the firmware is in a ROM, well, I've used computers whose firmware was in ROM and it didn't bother me. And hardware that cannot run free software. Well, that's actually a different question. Hardware that has firmware that is in ROM, often it can run free software. Why shouldn't it? Maybe if the ROM is documented enough, then people will know how to make the free software run on that computer. The PRISM program and the Snowden scandal should have taught us of the consequences of proprietary software. How is it possible that nothing has really changed? Well, I'd say because some powerful entities have control. You know, government agencies that want to snoop, businesses that want to snoop, businesses that are funded partly by those government agencies. I'm no expert, of course. I'm not an investigator. I don't know what goes on, except when someone else finds it out and I happen to read it. You talked about strategies to avoid running non-free software during studies. Any tips for For those of us that works, you mean employment, I have to run software on a Mac just because the boss likes it. Well, I don't think I would have taken that job. When I refuse to run non-free software, I'm serious. What do you think a student could do to enter the free software movement and simultaneously gain financial, basically wealth? I can't tell you a reliable way to do that. What I found in the 1980s was that, look, once I had released some free programs that people were using, I found that I could make enough money for a year in 7 weeks of paid work. Enough money for a year was around $35,000 a year back then. It would be more now, I guess. And that was 1/3 to spend, 1/3 to save, and 1/3 for taxes. That was more than I'd made before. And, but it was so much that after that, I wouldn't do any more paid work that year. What do you think of the best steps to obtain this final goal? Well, if it's a matter of being independently wealthy, I can't recommend any way to do that. What do you think about Android? Well, many parts of Android are free software, but important parts are non-free. For instance, the Google Play library, which many apps use, is non-free. So you better design, if you want free software, you better not include the Google Play library, so you won't be able to do much with the Google App Store. Of course, most of the things in that are non-free, but there are other sources of free apps, such as F-Droid. But the other problem is the device drivers. Every phone model has peripherals, and they keep changing those. So the hard part is the reverse engineering to figure out how to write free software to talk to those peripherals. And if you are clever and if you learn to be a good reverse engineer, you can contribute to that. Do you plan to add some AI software to the GNU project? Probably no. But again, AI, as I pointed out, it mixes up two very different kinds of things. And so I can't say anything that's sensible if I don't separate the two. Which are the non-free tools you found most difficult to replace? Well, the biggest job was writing a C compiler. Who produces free software? Workers, and who pays them? Well, sometimes free software is written by volunteers. Sometimes it's written by paid workers. And if they're paid, well, they can be paid by companies, they can be paid by universities, they can be paid by research grants or government contracts. Governments want to develop a lot of software, and once the government realizes that it's really foolish to pay to develop software it won't be able to control afterwards, it will insist on developing free software. Provision for the next 40 years on free software, that's too far ahead for me. I could never have imagined 40 years ago where we are today. even imagining 10 years ahead is not easy for me. That's not what I'm good at. AI will kill programming. I don't believe that. You'd be a fool to trust a bullshit generator to write code. It doesn't understand code any better than it understands anything else. Do you see a possible synergy with free software and, well, the question says AI. Is it talking about recognizing significant patterns, or is it talking about a bullshit generator? You shouldn't use a bullshit generator to do anything serious. Question from home. I'm not sure what that means. Large corporations such as Google or Microsoft can afford to raise the complexity of a code base so much that no group of users could ever afford to meaningfully study and modify it. A software distributed with a free software license, be it copyleft or a permissive one, well, I guess they could, but they wouldn't be able to maintain it either, is my expectation. Software that complicated tends to not do what users want. Now, it's true that companies often don't want their programs to do what users want. This is where dark patterns come from. Software designed to make it hard for the user. But I don't think this is a real problem. Do you still qualify such software as free? Yes, it is. If it's hard to maintain, that's going to be a problem for the official developers too. And it may be a bad program for that reason, but it isn't a non-free program for that. What are the limits and unaddressed issues of the last version of the GNU GPL? So far, I mean, I put these in a file, but there's none that's so significant that we need to make a new version of the license now. So I'm just saving those for in case we ever do. In your TED Talk, you clearly explain how people's fundamental rights work together and how free software is a human right necessary to grant free speech, etc. How do you explain the fact that large companies such as Google, Facebook, or Twitter, as I call it, use free software internally to violate such human rights? Well, there's no real contradiction there. It's a paradox, which is an appearance of contradiction if one looks at the matter carelessly. You can use free software to do anything. You can use free software to do things that are wrong. You can use free software to commit crimes. And I hope they catch you and put you in prison for those. But that doesn't make free software bad. You can use a pen to do good things, and you can use a pen to do bad things. But that's not a reason to put to prohibit pens or to require everyone to get a license to use a pen. There's someone using a pen right now. So yes, those companies use free software to do what they do. And some of what they do is very bad, and some of it perhaps should be illegal. But the license on a general purpose piece of software shouldn't dictate what users can do with it, because software developers shouldn't have that kind of power over users. If we're going to have a law against doing something, like for instance the law that makes fraud a crime, that should be decided democratically by a government, not by somebody writing a piece of software and saying, oh, using this to commit fraud violates the license. What if that that developer or another developer decides to say, oh, you're allowed to use this to commit fraud. If we were depending on software licenses to stop fraud, that is totally undependable. Because tomorrow, the company will say, you can use this to commit fraud provided you pay us enough. Can an LLM be free if you cannot something only study it and modify it and every data you use to compute it? I think you're talking about release of training data. We've come to the conclusion that in order for for any machine learning system, there are lots of kinds of machine learning, and they all use training data, and it's not just chatbots or bullshit generators. But in any case, we've come to the conclusion that a free machine learning system does have to have training data that are available to the public somehow, whether it's the public can get, but it doesn't have to be free if people can put in a patch script when they use it for training. Now, this is a peculiar thing that is found in a free program called TeX. It's a text formatter, and you're not allowed to edit the source file of TeX. But when you build it, you can use a patch file, which essentially edits it temporarily just to make the modified version that you want to build. So you can make a changed version of TeX. It's just divided into the original version source and the patch file. Well, with that technique, as long as the original version of that data is available, you can make your patch file and train your neural network or whatever it is, because there are other kinds of machine learning. You can train it with your modified training data, and so that's enough. Well, I've got no more questions here. Are there any more?
Yes, from.
Oh, there are. Okay. Are you still without Wi-Fi on your laptop? Actually, no, that may be a misunderstanding. I've generally had Wi-Fi, but in some cases, I needed to use an external Wi-Fi card. But this one does have Wi-Fi internally that works. Its Ethernet interface is broken, however. I have an external one I can use, though, if I need to. Can you suggest a Wi-Fi card or something with open firmware? Well, from my point of view, if the firmware in the Wi-Fi interface can't be modified by anybody, then it's equivalent to a ROM, and a ROM is okay. What I won't tolerate is if somebody else could change that program and I can't. That's where it becomes injustice. A ROM is not an injustice. Now, true ROMs are not used nowadays, but that's my ethical thoughts about them. What are your thoughts on blockchain for decentralized publishing journal system rewarding authors and reviewers? I don't have thoughts about that. Bitcoin doesn't, blockchain, I don't know that much about blockchains. I don't know how that would work. one difficulty with automatically rewarding people for doing things is that it may become hard to tell who's actually doing what, unless you demand they provide government identification, which has its own freedom problems. Don't you think having something of influence could help with circle? I don't understand that. This important message, or a larger circle of influence would help with this important message you have. Maybe so, but I only have the influence I have. That's what society determines. Individuals think about what I have to say, that gives me a bit more influence, and some others think I'm a fool and have no influence with them. Okay, that gives me a little less. Maybe that requires to bend the definition of our ethics for a better cause. No, I don't think so. If you corrupt yourself, then you may think you're still working for freedom and justice, but actually you've departed from it. You must above all be honest. What is your opinion about trusted computing and TPM usage? Well, the idea, I call it treacherous computing, because the idea there is that some company can trust your computer not to let you do certain things. That's what they want. It's called digital restrictions management. That's the reason they designed that scheme at all, is so that you could load certain signed programs into your computer, non-free programs signed by some company that designed them to restrict you, to control you. And then, because they're signed, they will be allowed to access certain data or peripherals. But if you try to write a program that would not be signed by that company, then it wouldn't be allowed to do anything. Well, this is subjugation. And my basic response is, forget that stuff. I just won't look at any of that stuff. So if you're streaming something and you're requiring me to run a non-free program to decode the stream, and otherwise it just won't be able to come out the speaker or appear on the screen, I'll just refuse to look at your streams. It's that simple. So, it's time for me to leave you outside so I can auction that means putting shoes on. And a sweater and coat.
So let's thank Richard Stallman for this talk.